Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on. If you're watching live, they'll show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And I hope that you had a wonderful weekend. And today and tomorrow, we're going to continue last week's conversation of classic horror tropes and the metaphysical and folkloric realities and history behind them. Today, we're going to talk about Frankenstein. And hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. And speaking of Mary Cavalcante, uh, if you were watching last night, we did our Beltane/Samhain ritual here on Corellian TV and Divination TV and throughout our many platforms. And I had the great pleasure of being joined by Mary Hawk, Mary Cavalcante, and Ebony Nash for a wonderful ritual. And if you haven't already seen it, I recommend it. It was a great time for us, and I think that you will enjoy it yourselves. And as we like to do, it celebrated both Beltane, the Sabbat being observed in the northern hemisphere, and Samhain, which is the Sabbat being observed in the southern hemisphere, because we know we have viewers taking part from all over the world. And Mary says, it was wonderful, thank you. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. And hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you, Antonio. And I don't know about you, but I am looking forward to Lustration. And so far, all the people who've said hello in the chat room will be seeing at Lustration, which will be wonderful. And Lustration is coming up on the 16th through the 19th of this month. So not very far away, 10 days away for the beginning of the event. And it's going to be a very special illustration. It will have all the things illustration normally has, but it's also going to be a double investiture for the incoming first priesthood. And, you know, that is something we have not done since 1979. I'd be surprised if we do it again, at least in my lifetime. So it will be quite a historic moment, and I hope that you will consider coming out to it. And it will be great fun. You can find out more about that at Corellian.com, and you can sign up for that if you're interested. Let me make sure I'm giving you the right one. You can sign up for it at Corellian.com/lustration-2024.html, and learn more about the event there. You can also find out more on Facebook, and we'll be talking about it. And Mary in the chat room says, "I can't wait! I'm so excited! It will be fun. It will be quite interesting." And yeah, I kind of can't wait myself, but then I always enjoy illustrations, and I think this will be particularly memorable. Now, in addition to our online Beltane/Samhain ritual last night, I also was involved in a real-time Beltane ritual at the gathering of Travelers Grove and Pure Sanctuary yesterday. If you follow my Facebook page, you'll see photos from that. It was quite enjoyable. One of the interesting things is that we did do a fire jump. And hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. And hello to Janet Winston in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. And yeah, we have photos of that. And this was the 30th anniversary for Travelers Grove as a group, and it was quite a lovely day. And so I want to thank Susan Dancing Star of Travelers Grove for all the wonderful things that she does. She will also be joining us at Lustration. It's going to be a lovely time. Now today we were going to talk about Frankenstein. And where do I start with Frankenstein? Well, you know, one of the things that's commonly said is that, people mistake the identity of Frankenstein and think Frankenstein is the name of the monster, um, and that it's not. And certainly in the title of the, I believe, 1931 film Frankenstein's Monster, that's true. But if your question is Frankenstein the monster? It kind of depends on how you read the book or which version of the cinematic enactment of the book you watch. I think a pretty good argument could be made that in the end, Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, is the monster in the story. And I was reading recently that Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, was a Pythagorean. And she viewed the character of Prometheus in a negative sense, partly because she was a vegetarian and she blamed the carnivorous diet on Prometheus. So when she called her novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, she was intending to specify the character of Frankenstein in a negative light. And if you read the book, that's definitely how it's presented. And I want to talk during this half hour about how Frankenstein is looked at in the cinematic versions versus the original book. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the book itself. If you're familiar with the story behind Frankenstein, it was written by Mary Shelley. I believe she was 16 years old when she began, and she began in the famous winter or a famous summer that she spent with her husband Percy Shelley, her sister, Lord Byron, and Dr. Polidori at a mansion on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And this occurred during the so-called Little Winter, a year of unusual coldness, even for that time. And this was during the so-called Little Ice Age. It was the height of that period of cold weather. And it's generally said there was very little actual summer that year. And that's one of the reasons why they spent so much time in the house doing literary things. And they created between them a contest for writing a ghost story, which was fashionable at that time, particularly in the German language, and beginning to become fashionable through the Gothic genre in English. And out of this summer came two full-blown horror genres: the vampire genre and the Frankenstein monster genre. And the vampire genre was created from the publication of the book Varney the Vampire, which was written by Dr. Polidori and apparently started by Lord Byron, and is generally thought to have been a commentary on Lord Byron. And hello to Steve in the chat room. It's good to see you, Steve. If you watch recreations of this period, there are at least two very good films dealing with this subject matter: Gothic and Haunted Summer. And there are probably others. And hello to Mystique in the chat room. They tend to portray Dr. Polidori as a rather pathetic figure, the spurned lover of Lord Byron, which he was. And Mary Shelley's sister Claire was also a spurned lover of Lord Byron. And Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley were there for that whole summer with both of these two spurned lovers of Lord Byron. In addition to which, Claire was also a lover of Percy Shelley, making it a very complex little situation and an entertaining little movie, however far it may depart from reality. But the character of Varney the Vampire is often thought to be based on Lord Byron, but many people feel that the character of Victor Frankenstein is based on Percy Shelley. And although Mary Shelley was devoted to Percy Shelley, there's a little bit of a criticism in there of her late husband. And I find that a very interesting wrinkle in the story. I've only recently heard that theory, But there are a number of reasons to think it, including that the ideas behind the theme of Frankenstein, the idea, for example, of using electric to and other ideas of how to revivify the dead were apparently something he was quite interested in. And at that time, uh, electrical experiments in galvanization were attempting to do exactly that. So it was a very topical novel on top of everything else, in a way that it would not be today. Today, we look at it and say, well, we know lightning is not going to bring a dead body to life. But at that time, they were not so sure. And they were actually waiting for this to be done in a lab. They thought it was coming. And there had been some experiments giving the impression that that might be possible. And that was one of the things they discussed in that summer at Villa Deodati at Lake Geneva. And according to Mary Shelley, it was that discussion about the experiments with galvanization that really started her thinking on what became the theme of her novel. But it's also worth saying that if you are familiar with cinematic Frankenstein, the idea that the creature was brought to life through electricity is second nature. But that isn't actually what the book says. The book is very ambivalent about how Frankenstein brings his creature to life. And I believe it directly compares it to alchemy. And another thing that the group had done that summer was visiting a number of prominent alchemical sites. And in the area en route to the villa was a castle that had been used by a notorious alchemical experimenter 100, 200 years before, which may have also been part of her inspiration. There are also people who think that they had gone to Castle Frankenstein or the town of Frankenstein in the area. But it is worth saying that the character of Victor Frankenstein was not originally uh, connected to the Barons Frankenstein who lived in that castle. So these are some of the interesting things that differentiate the books from the movies. The idea of the monster as an alchemical creature. Now, one of my favorite versions of cinematic Frankenstein is called Frankenstein, the True Story, I believe it is. And it starred, notably, Jane Seymour as the Bride of Frankenstein. And it was about 1973. And in a way, it's closer to the original work than most others. Because one of the things that it points out that certainly the James Whale movie and those based on it do not, is that Frankenstein intended for his creature to be beautiful. He was trying to create something along the lines of an ideal man. Now, in the novel, he was oversized. He was like 8 feet tall. So James Whale was right on track with that. But other than that, he had been put together from the most perfect parts that Frankenstein could find. And he wanted to create something good and beautiful and so forth. In Frankenstein, the True Story, they start with a beautiful monster who then slowly begins to rot. And in a way, although it is a bit of a differentiation from the novel, but in a way it is far closer to the actual story that Mary Shelley tells, which is about a creator being disillusioned with and effectively betraying their creation. And that's the point I'm going to be coming back to in this conversation. But in Frankenstein, the True Story, I believe it's Michael Saracen who plays the monster, and Leonard Whiting who plays Frankenstein, who were both very beautiful, as was Jane Seymour. It was a very beautiful cast. Um, but in that version of the story, Frankenstein has created this beautiful monster. He gives him a great education, um, teaches him to love society and people and fashion and literature, and then notices that things are going wrong and he's not perfect. And how does he deal with that? Well, he wants to destroy him, which is kind of along the lines of the novel. Now, in the novel, Frankenstein feels the monster is not perfect right from the beginning, because although he's put together what he thought was going to be a beautiful creature, it doesn't quite come to life that way. And in the novel, they never quite say what's wrong. Um, they imply it. There are a couple of specificities, but you're kind of left to imagine what was wrong with the monster. And it kind of says, at least as I read it, that at least initially it wasn't terribly obvious what had gone wrong. But from the start, he was disillusioned with what he had created. And the rest of the story is basically about Frankenstein ultimately trying to destroy his creation and the reaction of the creation to trying to be destroyed. And this is a fascinating story if you think about it. And if you look at the James Whale movie and most of the others, you do still see this story come through. One of the great things about the Frankenstein mythos is that the monster is not generally presented as a villain and was not really in that first novel either, but rather as a victim of their circumstances who perhaps reacted badly to it, but didn't have necessarily a lot of choice or a lot of knowledge to the contrary. There's a wonderful story from the James Whale film in which there's a scene where the monster takes a little girl and throws her into the river, thinking that it's just a little piece of fun, and the girl drowns. She'd been throwing flower petals into the river, and he thought he was doing basically the same thing. Had no intention of drowning the little girl, but there was a lot of fear that the little child actress was going to be terrified of dealing with the monster. And so Boris Karloff, who is playing the monster, arranged to drive to the site with the little girl in the same car and spent the whole time talking with her, making her feel comfortable, and really being what he always was, a perfect gentleman. If you're not familiar with Boris Karloff, as a person, he very much repays the time to find out about him. His personal character was every bit as fascinating as any part he ever played. Of course, that's often true. It's true of Lugosi too, but in a very different sort of way. But Karloff was known for being a wonderful gentleman, basically, which makes the nature of his career a little surprising. But that was talked about even during his lifetime, how different he was in person versus almost any character he played. And but this kind of speaks to what happens to the monster in the story, not really meaning in many cases to cause trouble. He did, and then also in pain for being, well, attempting to be killed. He became quite violent. But if you think about it, if the person that you know as your father or your creator is trying to kill you, you're likely to be rather upset about it too. And that's a big part of the meaning of the book. But the part I really want to talk about with this is a major difference between the book and what you normally come away from the cinema versions with. And if you look at the cinema versions of Frankenstein and many other cinematic horror films that involve different kinds of science experiments gone wrong, they almost always come down to the idea that, quote, man should not play God, blah, blah, and that it's all the fault of science. and people trying to move forward too fast or in the wrong ways, which was a very 20th century kind of thing. It's not remotely the theme of Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. The theme of Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus is not so much that Frankenstein should not be playing God, but that Frankenstein symbolizes the Judeo-Christian idea of God. And the novel is actually about, I would say, and I'm not the first one to say it, Mary Shelley's understanding of the relationship between humankind and their creator in a Judeo-Christian type of mindset. A deity who attempted to create a beautiful creature, accidentally created something flawed, and then became, well, tried to destroy it, became very harsh towards it, spent the rest of history treating it badly within that mythology. Again, Shelley herself apparently was Pythagorean, and so not necessarily sharing that view, but perhaps wanting to talk a little bit about what normal people weren't seeing in how they were perceiving deity. If deity is always trying to destroy humanity, there's a problem. And the problem isn't necessarily with humanity. Um, and that kind of is the theme of the book, that it's Frankenstein, not the creature, who in the end is the monster. And if you read the original book and you go to the end where they are alone in, I believe it's an ice cave in the frozen wastes, the monster tells him that in as many words. Um, I'll paraphrase extensively, but I didn't ask to be born. You created me. I did nothing wrong. You tried to destroy me. My existence has been very difficult, and you still hate me. What's wrong? And it really kind of encapsulated the message that I think she was trying to send in this book. And it's largely been not translated into the cinema, but I think particularly for us as largely non-Christians, um, some of us, of course, are Christo-pagan, um, some may be atheists, but in general, for people who are not necessarily coming primarily from that point of view, to realize that this is part of what that book is about, and to think about it, and to ask yourself, how exactly can you make peace with that kind of image of deity? And it certainly still animates a lot of people's thought today. So that's the main thing I wanted to bring out about the Frankenstein mythos. That originally it was not about um, how humankind should not play God, but about how God, as perceived by humankind, was far from perfect. And Mary Hawk in the chat room says, fascinating. I've never read the book. You probably won't either, but I recommend it. But it is a piece of 19th century literature. What does that mean? That means it's incredibly long, rather complex, far more complex than we would write a novel today. Worth the reading, but I think a lot of modern readers would have trouble getting through anything from that period. I have read lots of 19th century novels. That's part of why I am the way I am. But it does require a longer willingness to stick with it, and tolerance for a lot of side stories coming in. Beginning with the very way the book is set out itself, because it's set out basically as a series of letters between the captain of the ship, where Frankenstein dies, and his sister, where the captain recounts Frankenstein's story to his sister. Now, Mary Cavalcante says maybe Audible. Yes, I would say that might be easier. Um, in the 19th century and before, and even the early 20th century, people had a different relationship to novels and other written works. Certainly, people did read them alone, but very often they read them as familial entertainment. The entire family would gather around, they'd read a chapter a night, and they planned for this to stretch through maybe a whole winter. They wanted to use it as entertainment for a long time. That's why they're so long. The other thing that happened a lot in the 19th century were serial novels. Dickens was especially known for this. And the novels would come out one chapter at a time, and they would be long precisely so you'd have to buy more chapters because capitalism has been with us for a while. Uh, but they're worth reading, in my opinion. But you do need to be prepared to give it that time. If you can get an audio version, it is, I think, highly beneficial. And be prepared to have a dictionary at hand because these people had and used wide vocabularies, as one does. And some of those words are no longer commonly in use today. So it's a wonderful chance to enlarge your vocabulary as well. So I highly recommend reading Frankenstein or The New Prometheus and many other 19th century novels. And with just a couple of minutes left, let me tell you about the last 19th century horror novel that I read, which is also one of my favorites. It's called The String of Pearls. And I found it in an anthology called Penny Dreadfuls, which I have here in my office. This is the original version of the Sweeney Todd story, which, by the way, is not based on any kind of actual history, but it is one of those serial novels from the early 19th century. Fascinating novel, very different from anything you're likely to have seen um, in the various versions of Sweeney Todd that are more contemporary. First and foremost, in that it has a female protagonist who is presented as a very brave, enterprising person uh, and very independent despite the time period. Now, that's not to say the book is entirely ahead of its time, but in many ways it is. The character of Mrs. Lovett is also present. The character of Joanna is actually the protagonist in the novel, whereas in modern versions, she's basically a piece of window dressing. The character of Mrs. Lovett is not remotely insane. She's simply totally morally corrupt and knows exactly what she's doing and is perfectly sane in choosing to do it. Um, it's a fascinating novel, and interestingly enough, it's largely, in a manner of speaking, a commentary on women's rights at the time and what was wrong with the situation. And it varies in different chapters because they weren't all written by the same person. But for the most part, it's very, very progressive in how it looks at women and women's rights. So I highly recommend finding The String of Pearls and reading it. But again, it takes some patience. Now, Mystique says, my mom always tells me about my great great grandmother who used to read every night into the late hours. It was very important to her that people, especially women, read. And, I totally agree. Um, Now, in our current era, I would say not only read books, but read whatever you can read. I don't go to books very often anymore. I read mostly on my phone or my computer, but I'm still reading extensively, and I'm sure I always will. Um, and I think that cinema is also a very useful tool in self-education if you remember, as you must also remember with much literature, that it's frequently entertainment, not history. Um, and another thing that I've watched little bits of, The Crown from BBC, is a good example of entertainment presenting history in a way that has some parts right and many parts wrong. Um, the reign of the 20th century, if you would. But but with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. Once again, I want to recommend lustration to you, and you can find out more about that at correllian.com/lustration-2024.html. And I want to recommend my Patreon at revdonlewis.com. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the um, about classic horror tropes, and tomorrow we'll be talking about mummies, including um, mummy literature, mummy films, and of course, the famous idea of the mummy's curse. So please join me for that. And with that, let us close with our prayer as we always do. And I'll see you tomorrow. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you that all you do for us in our lives to carry us forward. And we ask you to continue to be with us and to help us as we go forward. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to appreciate the things that we create and to own the consequences of our actions. And if we find that things are not as beautiful as we intended them to be, that instead of destroying them, we do the next right thing to make them better. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, with great love and thanks, we thank you for all that you do for us, and knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.